Okay, and before we get started, I do want to point out a quick resource for you because I will be using a couple HDRs from this resource that I found online. It is free, so it's basically this user under DeviantArt. So go ahead and take a look at this URL up here and go ahead and write that down, take a screen capture, do what you got to do, because there's 3 free HDRI packs on here that are actually pretty decent. They're all studio lightings. I think there is actual one or two photo environments as well, but I'll be using a couple of these throughout the webinar. Like I said, they're all free, and they'll just be some additional studio lighting environments that you'll have at your disposal. So I'll just leave that up for just a second so you can go ahead and make sure you get that URL down, and I would suggest downloading that. Okay, so let's go ahead and get rolling, and I'll keep that up so we can show that at the end of the webinar in case anybody missed it. Okay, so as you know from the webinar header that you received in your email, this is the image that we're going to be creating back here. We have this space mouse, and we have a couple different challenges that we have to face, and that is we have some shiny plastic here, we have some rough plastic, we have some glowing lights, and we have a brushed metal. Now the thing about product photography and design in general, if you have a product that has a shiny surface, whatever lighting you have needs to clearly communicate that that surface is shiny. If you have a matte surface, whatever lighting you have needs to communicate that that surface is matte. And also, if you have a surface that's round, you need to make sure that the light falls across it in a certain way that it does communicate that that surface is round. It's all about just clear visual communication of what that product is. So let's go ahead and unpause KeyShot here, and we'll start from scratch. Now, I've been doing projects with this software since about 2008, and during that time I've learned a lot about things to do and things not to do, and hopefully I can share some tricks with you today that will help speed up your process and save you some frustration later on down the road. First thing I want to go ahead and point out is about this ground shadow here. Many of you may have seen in an instance that your ground shadow looks kind of blocky or low quality and it's not very sharp and defined. So the first thing we're going to do is address that. So under the environment tab, we have this ground size option. What I'm going to do is drop that all the way down as low as I can without clipping this shadow. And what I mean by that is if you start to see this shadow just falling off sharply and it looks very unnatural, like it just stops and falls off the edge of a cliff or something like that, you know you've decreased the ground size too low. There is more in the manual about the ground size and what it actually does. We won't be covering it in detail today. Just know that for the best quality shadow, you want to decrease this as low as you possibly can. Okay? The next thing we want to do is we want to make sure we lock down our camera, okay? Because we're going to be rendering essentially different passes. We're going to set up lighting for shiny plastic, we're going to set up lighting for brushed metal, and we need to be able to layer this together in Photoshop and have everything fit seamlessly on top of each other. So very first thing before we do anything is we're going to establish our camera. I've already set this up, and under the camera view I'm just going to go ahead and click this little plus box, and I'll call this Final View. And if you press enter, that camera is now named Final View. Next thing I'm going to do is just go ahead and save. It's always good to save your work. Sometimes things happen and it's never fun to have to go back and redo things. So now that the camera's saved, let's start working on lighting. Now, materials. Now with the current lighting environment, I'm using just the startup.hdr. I'm using the startup.hdr, A, because KeyShot automatically starts with this, and B, because it's a neutral environment. There's not a whole lot of contrast, there's no color in it, so when I'm setting up materials, I'm not going to get some sort of false representation of that material color. If this environment was, say, blue or red or had something else, that blue or red light is going to cast onto my materials, and it's going to make the color look a bit off from what the material's natural color is. Whenever you're setting up materials, I highly suggest using this one or use any of the studio environments that don't have any color in them. Like I said, it's neutral. So let's just start by double-clicking this top piece here, and we'll change this from diffuse over to plastic. And what we're going to do is change the diffuse color down to black. And if you look here, it looks like this reflection is a bit rough, and that's because we have some roughness applied. So we're going to go ahead and start to drop this down. Okay? So that means that this surface is perfectly polished. Now the next thing I'm going to do, since I know this material down here is going to be essentially the same as this, which is just a shiny plastic, I'm just going to go ahead and press Shift left click and Shift right to paste. There is one important thing to understand about that, and that is that these materials are now linked. Okay, so if I change the color of one, it's going to affect both of them. If you decided you didn't want those to be linked, all you have to do right after you paste it is select Unlinked Material, and now you can edit those independently. Okay, but since they are the same, I'm just going to go ahead and recopy and paste that so that those materials are linked. I also do have a material under here, this orange portion, that I also want to be black. So what I'll do, I'll right-click and select Hide Part, and I'm going to copy this plastic up here, Shift left click and Shift right to paste. And there's two surfaces intersecting each other here, so I'll just paste that. Whenever you have two surfaces sitting on top of each other, you may see an artifact like that. And let's go ahead and show all parts. Okay. Now, this shiny plastic is a good starting point for a rough plastic. So I'm just going to use that to create my sort of matte rubber look back here. So I'll Shift left click here and Shift right to paste. Now, this is a shiny plastic, and also now these materials are linked. So what I need to do is right click, say Unlink Material, and now if I double click on that one and adjust the roughness, we're only going to see that affecting this, and not the top button and not the side plastic. Okay. Now, moving on, go ahead and save. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to set up our brushed metal. Well, actually, let's just go ahead and copy and paste this to our buttons. So, because these materials are essentially the same, and if I decide later that I want to edit them independently, I certainly can. The other thing I do want to point out, when I was clicking in the interface, my camera did move slightly. So I just want to go back and make sure that I am still rested on this final view. And another thing you can do to avoid that in the future is just press this locked button. Now, when you click around in here, you can select materials, you can click all day long, and you're not going to mess up your camera view. Yeah, it's extremely important to maintain that view. If you do two renders and they don't line up in Photoshop, you're going to be quite frustrated. Okay, so now let's go ahead and do this brushed metal. So just double click on this material, go to metal. Also, I do want to point out, a lot of these materials we do have available in the library, but the reason I'm doing it this way is because creating materials in KeyShot is so easy. You know, I personally find it faster, and I like to tune the materials myself. Also, just to help educate you guys about how materials are created. Okay, so what I did, double-clicked on that material, and I'm going to go ahead and go over to the color, and I'm just going to go ahead and grab this brush texture. Okay, we're going to apply that on there, and currently it looks like the UV coordinates work well for this. I'm going to switch it to cylindrical so I can show you some things about cylindrical mapping. If you're not sure what UV coordinates are, your model probably isn't going to have them, and you're probably going to need to resort to something like cylindrical mapping anyways. So let's go ahead and also add a bump texture. I'm going to use the same texture, and this is going to create some sort of bump effects. It's going to simulate that brushed pattern, and if I increase this bump height, it's going to make it more apparent. Okay. The other thing I'm going to do, because these textures are meant to work together, you see down here in the textures box we have this sync button. When you check sync, that means if you adjust anything like scale or any of the mapping, both of these textures are going to follow those same adjustments. So they're synced together. They're always going to remain in the correct position in relation to each other. So let's go ahead and change this from UV coordinates to cylindrical. And let's click the mapping tool and see what we have going on here. And we have this cylinder, and that indicates basically where this texture is projected. We want it to wrap around the other way, so I'm just going to click this rotate box, and I'm going to rotate this up, and we start to get that brushed effect going around there. And you may just want to take a little bit of time and fine-tune it, make sure it's positioned correctly. And the other thing I'm probably going to do is add a slight amount of roughness to this so that we start to spread out those highlights and reflections a little bit. So I just did that under the Properties tab. Other thing you can do when you do have textures applied is you can adjust the brightness and the contrast of that texture. If you want it brighter, that's available under the Properties tab in any of the material types that support textures. You can decrease the contrast. So if those lines are a bit too pronounced for me, I can knock this back. And now if it just feels a bit too bright, I can drop the brightness and really sit and fine-tune this material. Okay. So when I'm doing this sort of stuff and I'm setting up different renders for different materials, I like to save out different BIP files for each one of those. And I always start with an initial render. So I'll do Save As, and I'm going to do Space Mouse Initial Render. And one more thing, let's just go ahead and set up an emissive material on here so we can have that glowing effect. So we'll set it to emissive, we'll give it a nice blue color, and we'll turn up the intensity, and you should start to see that light affecting its surrounding materials. Okay. All right. We'll leave it there for now. We'll be doing a lot of fine-tuning in Photoshop on this, so not too concerned. I just want to make sure that light is actually illuminating under here. The other thing you'll want to know is if detailed indirect illumination is not on under the Settings tab, your emissives may not affect other diffuse materials. So if you're using emissives, you probably want to make sure that detailed indirect illumination is on. Okay, so now let's set up our first lighting pass here. And I'm probably just going to use one of the default KeyShot environments. And I do know which one I'm looking for here. And it's this one right here. Okay, so we'll drop that in. And what I'm looking for here, again, we're going to isolate all these areas and do separate renders for everything. So the way I started this particular project is I was kind of looking for something that gives me a nice reflection up here to work with to really define this shiny plastic. So we'll go ahead and use that. And what I'm going to do is also turn off the ground shadows, because we're going to have a separate environment for our shadow lighting as well. Right now, look how much this shadow just kind of extends out in this, blobby sort of ambiguous form. And we probably want a tighter, more defined shadow. So we'll do that separately. And this is why you want to go ahead and probably separate lighting and render different passes for certain things if you're doing shots for marketing and for print. Because the lighting that makes this look good up at the top might not make the lighting down here look good, and it might not make your shadow look good. I'm also just going to go ahead and set the background color to black for now. And let's go ahead and crank this out. I'm also going to use network rendering today. So for those of you who are interested in network rendering and you're curious how it works, I can give you a little preview of that. It's actually quite a big improvement upon our old system. And I want to point this to a different directory. So I'm selecting where my rendering is going to save out to. So let's go to Space Mouse, and then I have a passes folder in here. And this is pretty standard process for me. I always save out a folder called passes in whatever project I'm doing, and I keep all the different renders in there just to kind of keep it organized. So we're going to call this Space Mouse Initial Render.tiff. Okay, and I'm also doing TIFF 32-bit output. 32-bit output is really, really a great thing. And the reason it's a great thing is because you can always pull back detail in areas that are either overexposed or underexposed. It's like a brightness slider on steroids in Photoshop. You know, if you ever adjust brightness in Photoshop and you notice your white areas might just become muddy or cloudy and there's really no detail in there, 32-bit output doesn't have that issue. All the information is saved. Okay, so I'm also going to click Send to Network. So when you have network rendering available on your system, you go ahead and select this option. And before I render, I do want to just go ahead and look over my render settings here. I am going to go ahead and go with 64 samples. That is decently high. I wouldn't go much beyond 128 if I were you. Really, 64 is pretty good. And the only reason I'm actually using 64 right now is because I have an emissive material. And the emissive material a lot of times requires more samples than others. So I'm just go ahead and set that up a little higher. Ray bounces I can leave at 6, and anti-aliasing I'll keep it at 2. Everything else I'm just going to keep at the defaults. So we'll go back over here, send to network, and what you get is this sending job to the network queue. And I'll go ahead and show you what the network queue looks like so you can see what's going on there. It's quite a good thing. When you have a job processing, it's going to show you what's going on here. So you can see that the status is the image is rendering, and you can see a preview of your image. So you can see it actually blocking in and filling in that image right there. Also, down in the lower right corner, it tells you how many slaves are connected, and it says how many cores you have. The nice thing about this network rendering is I could dynamically add and remove slaves during render time. So in other words, say a slave went down during this rendering process, or maybe I had another slave available that I wanted to add to this to speed up the render time. You can do that while the image is rendering, and it won't affect your final output. Okay, looks like this is about done. So if we go to our Space Mouse folder, and we look in the passes, there it is. So we have our Space Mouse initial render. And let's go ahead and move over into Photoshop, and we'll start setting up our final composite. And then we're going to start breaking things down bit by bit, solving problems as far as lighting is concerned, and you'll really start to see this image take shape and come together. Okay. So another thing I do want to mention to you is we did render this with an alpha channel, and if you look in the channels palette, you'll see that there's RGB but no alpha. Okay, this is something that changed with the way that Photoshop handles transparency in CS5. So what you got to do, if you go to Layer, Layer Mask, and select From Transparency, now you can see we have our alpha. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and just delete this layer mask for now. Okay, now, do you see up here where it says RGB 32? That means we're in 32-bit mode. And like I mentioned to you before, that means that all this detail is retained in these lights and darks. And you don't use brightness and contrast when you're in 32 bits, you use what's called exposure. So if I select exposure, I just kind of want to show you here, look what's going on. So even in those areas where that was completely blown out, we still have that brush detail in there. And that really is the beauty of working in 32 bits. Okay. Now, the one thing about working in 32 bits, you'll notice that a lot of your Photoshop tools aren't available. Okay. So what I do when I'm working in this method is I have my 32-bit renders always available, but I also create an 8-bit composite file. So I'm just going to create a new Photoshop document. I'm going to set the width to 10 by 8, and I'm going to set it to 300 dpi. Okay, because we are doing this for print, so we do need, you know, the DPI is important. Now, on the note of DPI, I do want to show you something. This might have confused some of you in the past. If we look at our render and we look at the properties, look what it says. It says 72. Okay, but I want to prove to you that you still have 8 by 10 inches DPI, because really what matters there is the pixel count. Okay, the pixel count never changes. I don't care if it's 300 DPI, 600 DPI. These pixels are always going to equal 10 by 8 inches at 300 DPI. So let me show you. So if we go to our layers, and I'm going to press Control A. Then I'm going to press Control C to copy this. And then in the final composite, I'm going to press Control Shift V. Okay? That pastes it in place. And now look what we have here. We have an image that is 10 inches by 8 inches at 300 dpi. And like I said, it's this pixel count that matters, not necessarily what the dpi says. So just in case that ever threw any of you off. Okay, I'm going to delete the background layer as well. And the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to set up a masks file so that we can easily select different areas of this image. So we'll go back over to KeyShot, and I'm going to save this out as space mouse masks. Okay. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and set up some flat materials on here that are going to allow us to easily select different areas of the model with the magic wand tool in Photoshop. Okay, so I set that up. I'll press Shift left click, Shift right to paste, and then I'll right click and say unlink material. Now if I change this, remember these are able to be edited independently. And I'll unlink this material, and you see where I'm going with this. So this is going to allow us to easily select these elements in Photoshop with a single click. Okay. The main thing is you just want contrast between your surrounding areas. Okay. So for this, we don't need 32-bit output. We're not concerned about lights and darks. All this is just simple flat shading so we can have some masks. So we're going to rename this to Space Mouse Masks. It's still going to the same folder. This time I'm not going to use network rendering because these files always render very fast with the flat material. I will keep the alpha channel, and I'll render. Okay. Now go ahead and pause KeyShot by pressing Shift P, so that frees up our processors so we can go back to Photoshop. Okay. Now let's go ahead and open up our masks file. Okay. Now remember when I created an 8-bit composite and I'm not working in the 32-bit mode? That's because, well, one of the main reasons is because the Magic Wand tool is not available in 32-bit mode. So I'm going to select this by pressing Control A. Then I'm going to press Control C to copy it. And here in my Photoshop document, I'm going to press Control Shift V, which pastes that right over the top of it. Let's also go ahead and save out this composite. And this is typically how I work. I'll call this Space Mouse Composite. So I know this is my final image that I'm creating. Okay. So we're done with this mask file. We can close it. It's already in here. And whenever you have a layer in Photoshop, you can select that layer, and if you press Control and click on the thumbnail, it will create a selection around there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that to subtract the background of the underlying layer. So I just selected it, pressed Control Shift I to invert the selection, and we're going to delete the background. Okay? All right, and back there we'll just go ahead and just put a white background on a separate layer for now. Okay. You know what, actually I'm going to back up because there's one step that I missed that's actually really important. Before I go deleting the background, what you want to do with these mask layers is go ahead and just go Layer, Matting, Defringe by 1 pixel. That basically removes this 1 pixel border around the edge. And if you've ever had problems with edges, if you've used this mode or this method, that's going to help with that. So let's do that one more time. So all I did was select the layer by pressing Control, left click, and then I'm going to press Control Shift I to invert the selection, and let's delete our background. Okay. Don't notice much as far as why I did that step, but trust me, it makes a big difference. So I just created a new layer, and let's press Shift F5, which is the shortcut key for fill. And I'm sure you notice that I like to use a lot of shortcut keys. It really helps speed up your process when you're doing this stuff if you get to know them. Okay, so let's go ahead and name our layers so we have some organization here. I'm going to name this masks. I'm going to name this one initial render. Okay, and what we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and copy this shiny plastic and start fixing that. So because we're in 8-bit mode, we can use the magic wand tool. So we'll have our masks layer selected, and I'm going to hide that layer. And on the initial render layer, I'll go ahead and press Control-J, which what that does is that takes your selection and duplicates it to a new layer. So if we take a look here, we have this separate. Okay, and again, let's just stay organized. We'll rename this. We'll call this shiny plastic top. Okay. The next thing we need to do, if you notice here, I'm not a big fan of this reflection that comes in, it creates this kind of funky shape and then moves back out. I'd like to see it just make a nice, even, gradual curve across there to simplify the reflection and still define a couple things. One, that this surface is round, and two, that it's a shiny plastic. Okay, so let's take our pen tool, and we're going to draw a nice looking curve here. Okay, and what we're going to do with that is we're going to open up the Paths palette. We'll go Window, Paths, and we're going to make a selection. Okay, now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bust out my Wacom tablet. Okay, for those of you who are interested in doing work like this, if you don't do it already, I would highly suggest getting a Wacom or other tablet device if you don't have one. And the reason is it's a lot more natural to be able to draw with a pen than it is with, you know, a mouse. So I highly recommend getting one of those. And as far as the size of the Wacom is concerned, or whatever tablet device, they come in different sizes. You can get large ones, you can get small ones. Me personally, I prefer the small ones. I've never found a benefit to having a large one, and I like the portability. You can sit on an airplane seat and do this stuff, and you don't have to worry about, you know, having enough space on your desk for it. So I just find it more convenient. So what we're going to do is take our brush tool, we're going to sample this black, and on a new layer we're going to start to paint some black. Okay? And I'm not too concerned if I go outside the edge, and I'll show you why. So let's go ahead and press Control-D, and you can see we've simplified our reflection there. Control-D deselected, by the way. And we have this shiny plastic top still around. You can see when I painted, I went outside the edges, right? But again, if I control left click on this shiny plastic top, I get that selection already. And then I can press Control-Shift-I and go to that layer and delete. So there you go. And we've just cleaned up that reflection. So pretty easy to do. Okay, and let's save our work. And now that I have cleaned it up, it's really up to you if you want to clean or if you want to flatten your layers or keep them. I'll go ahead and just flatten them because I know I'm happy with this. So I'm just going to select both of these and press Control-E, which flattens them, and we'll call this shiny plastic top. Okay, so let's move on down the product here. So let's take a look at what's going on and what we need to improve. This is really getting lost in here. If you look, we have this shiny plastic up top that's blending into this matte rubber surface, and that's definitely not going to work. So we need to go ahead and address that. So let's go back to KeyShot, and let's open up our initial render file. Okay. Make sure my camera's locked. And let's set up some lighting to make this look better. Okay. So what I'll do, this is one of those studio environments that I pointed out to you earlier in the beginning of the webinar that you can download for free offline. So I'll go ahead and drag and drop this in. And if you missed that, I'll go ahead and show you where you can download those studios at the end of the webinar. Okay. Let's also make our background color black, and we're going to turn off ground shadows. Okay. So what I'm looking for here is something that just...
we're getting some reports of the video being frozen. Can you just try stop showing your screen and then start it again?
Sure.
Let them know we're looking into this.
Okay, apparently there's some video issues, so I'm going to see what I can do to resolve that for you. Okay. Let's see if this is back. Everything back to normal?
I'll let you know.
Okay. All right.
Okay, yep.
Okay, sorry about that, everyone. So anyways, if there's anything you missed during that time, just let us know, and we'll revisit that at the end of the webinar. Okay. So I have this studio environment set up that I really like, and I like it because you see we have some lighting on the rim here, and you know these different lights hitting this surface that really help define it. You know, I mean, we've got some contrast in there, and it helps communicate that it's round, and it also these highlights on the edge help pop it off the background and help pop it off the surrounding parts. So we'll go ahead and go with this, and in case you're not sure what I'm doing here, I'm pressing Control and I'm left clicking, which is rotating our environment so that you can control the positioning of the lights. Okay. You can also adjust height, and you can also adjust the size. All of these are methods for controlling your HDR lighting and manipulating it more to what you're looking for. Okay. So one thing I do want to show you, if you're rendering out individual elements, you can always use a region render. Okay, so if I select region render, if you have the Pro version, this gives you a selectable area, and you can basically tell KeyShot, okay, I only want you to render this portion, nothing else. All right, so we'll go back to our output, and I want to make sure it's going to the same folder. So Space Mouse, passes, and I'm going to call this Space Mouse Rubber Grip. Okay. And I am going to keep this TIFF 32-bit output. I do want all the control of the highlights and shadows. And we'll go ahead and keep all this the same. Actually, one thing before I render, looks like I didn't save my emissive material, so I do want the light actually affecting that material. So I'll set that up really quick. Okay. So let's go back to our region render, output, and let's go ahead and one more thing. See this option here that says background? If I select render in background, that's going to allow me to keep working in this KeyShot instance, so I can set up other things as well while that image renders. Okay. So we'll go render in background. And you can see we're only rendering out that center portion that we selected. Okay, and because I did render in background, we can keep working. So let's turn off region render, and let's save this as Space Mouse Rubber Grip, because if we decide we want to change something about that, we have this bit file with that lighting set up that we can go back and revisit. Okay, now let's talk about this base plastic right here. We need to set up some lighting for that. And the main thing is, you know, we want to communicate that it's shiny plastic, and we want to be able to communicate that it is round. And you also have these other surfaces here that are jutting out where the buttons go. So all that we want to make sure we can define clearly with our lighting. Okay. And through some trial and error, I found that this one works pretty decent. What I like about it is, you know, you have this nice sharp reflection here, and you've got some brighter light off to the side that rolls off and cuts across. And we'll be doing a little bit of fine-tuning in Photoshop to clean this up even more. If you look here, you have this little line cutting across here. We probably wouldn't want that, and same with here. Okay, looks like our rubber grip file is done, so we'll close that. And let's save this out as base plastic lighting. So Space Mouse, base plastic. And what we can do, we'll go over, we'll select Enable Region Render. We'll select just that area, so that's all we need. And we'll rename the output file, Space Mouse, base plastic. And let's go ahead and press Render in Background. Okay. All right, so while that renders, we'll go back to Photoshop and we'll pull out our file that we set up for this rubber plastic area. So there it is, Space Mouse Rubber Grip.tiff. By the way, when you open 32-bit images, it's going to Photoshop will prompt you. The document Space Mouse Rubber Grip.tiff does not have embedded RGB profile. Just leave everything at default. Press OK. Okay. Next thing we're going to do is if we want to, say, tune any of this as far as the contrast or the exposure, we want to do it here in the 32-bit file. So let's go over to Adjustments, Exposure, and we can do things like lessen contrast by increasing the gamma. We can increase contrast by decreasing the gamma. And we can also increase the brightness by adjusting the exposure. So I'm looking for a little bit more contrast here than what I initially put out. So I'm going to drop the gamma down to around 0.8, and I'm going to increase the exposure. All that's going to do is increase the contrast between our lights and darks. Okay, so now that I've done that, I'm going to press Control-A to select all. I'm going to press Control-C to copy. And then in our composite over here, I'm going to press Control-Shift-V, which pastes that on top. So, big problem. We just pasted on top of our shiny plastic, which we already corrected. Fortunately, there's an easy fix. We have our masks file here. So let's go ahead and select our magic wand tool. We're going to select this rubber grip area. We're going to press Control-Shift-I to select the inverse, and we're going to delete. Okay? So now we've successfully replaced that. And the other thing I want to mention, if you're doing stuff like this, I highly recommend working at high resolution. The reason is you're going to get a lot better selections when you're selecting your masks. And it's a lot easier to do touch-up when you have some detail to work with. Okay, let's see how our render is doing for the shiny plastic. Looks like we're done, so let's go ahead and replace that. So let's open up our base plastic. Again, we're prompted with this little notification here. We'll press OK. And I don't think I'm really going to do anything as far as exposure and gamma on this. So I'm just going to go ahead and press Control-A to select all, Control-C to copy, and Control-Shift-V to paste in place. Okay, and we'll go back to our masks file. And what we're going to do is select this base layer, Control-Shift-I to invert, and delete. Okay, so bit by bit we're starting to replace all this. And let's also rename our layers so we stay organized. Call this base plastic. Call this rubber grip. And we're going to save our work. Okay, this brings us to the brushed metal portion. So let's see if we've done any renders that would work for that. It doesn't look like it. So let's go back to KeyShot and we'll create something. I'm going to turn off region render, and I do like this studio environment that we used earlier right here, Studio 7. I like it because we get these nice highlights here that kind of roll around that surface and give us a nice look. We also, again, get that the rim lighting that helps pop this off a background. So let's go in here. We'll go ahead and go with this lighting, and let's save this out as Space Mouse Brushed. Okay. And we'll go ahead and enable a region render. And we'll call this Space Mouse Brushed. And let's keep it TIFF 32. We definitely, for this one, want TIFF 32, because looking here, we have this blown out area. You may want to come back and bring back some detail there, but we'll see what it looks like in the final composite. So there we go. That's going to render. And the other thing I want to do is let's start talking about ground reflections and shadows. I'm also going to set this up, like I said in the beginning, so that we have the option to have a ground shadow, and we have the option to have a ground reflection without having to go back and re-render things. Okay, so let's save this as Space Mouse Reflection. This is going to be one of the easiest ones to do. It doesn't take much at all. Okay, and let's go over to our project window. You can do that by pressing spacebar or clicking on the project button. And let's turn on ground reflections. Now, very important, if you're going to do this and you want it to be able to work on any color background, you need to make sure that your background color is black. So we'll save this. Now that we've made our change, we'll go back, we'll enable a region render, and let's get this ground reflection. So Space Mouse ground reflection, and let's render. Okay, so that's rendering in the background. Next, let's go ahead and set up our shadow. So we'll save this as Space Mouse Shadow. Okay, and for this one, it's actually important that if you want to be able to place this on any color background, you're going to want to use a white background. Okay, so we'll set our background color to white. We'll go ahead and enable ground shadows. Okay, and let's take a look at some different environments that we have that can create a ground shadow for me. These overhead panel low 2Ks, these are going to produce a pretty evenly distributed shadow around your object. And we're not really concerned about, what the lighting looks like. All we're looking at here is the shadow. It's the only thing that matters. Looks like our brushed is done. Okay, I like this, soft shadow look here. So let's go ahead and take that. And what we're going to do with this, I'm going to use network rendering, and we're going to increase the shadow quality a bit, which can be a bit more taxing in terms of render time. I'm also going to turn off ground reflections. We only want shadows here. So under the Settings tab, I can adjust this shadow quality, and I can turn it up and see how that's going to affect things. Let's try a value of 4, and you should see this shadow changing in appearance. And that's giving us a nice amount of detail there. So let's go over to the render window. And what we want to do, since we tuned our shadow quality in settings, and we're happy with this value of 4, we're going to want to make sure that in the render output window, that value corresponds. So shadow quality 4. And let's go to our output, and we'll call this Space Mouse Shadow. And save the work. We'll send it to network. And we'll go ahead and let that do its thing. Okay, so if we look at our network queue, you can see that it's in progress. If we look at the preview, we should start to see that filling in, and it's going pretty fast. Like I said, we're taking advantage of 80 cores there, 3 different slaves. And let's go back over here and we'll pause KeyShot. And let's go back to Photoshop and start layering in some more of the things that we have. So we do have our brushed. Let's open that up. And let's take a look here at our exposure and gamma. Like I said, all that brushed material or texture is still retained in there. Another thing we can do is something called HDR toning. And what that's going to do is display this 32-bit image in such a way that you kind of get the best of both worlds. You can keep some contrast, and you can pull out the detail where it's missing. We're going to change this just to exposure and gamma. It's the most simple. And let's just kind of tune this to get something that gives us a decent amount of contrast, but still provides some detail in there. Okay. And this is one of those things, you could sit and noodle this for hours, so be careful. Okay. Okay, so we'll just settle on that for now. You get the idea. So Control A, Control C. Now let's go back to Space Mouse Composite. Control Shift V. And let's isolate our brushed by bringing back the masks. And we'll press Control Shift I and delete. Okay. Okay, let's see what else we got here. We should have our ground reflection should be available. And it is. So let's bring this in. Okay, now remember in the beginning when I showed you about alpha channels and transparency in Photoshop? What we want to do is go to Layer, Layer Mask, and select From Transparency. So that brings back our layer mask. And let's just delete that so that we get our ground reflection here. Now I'm going to press Control Shift or Control A, and then Control C, and Control Shift V to paste in place. Okay, and let's call this reflection. And this is the next important step as far as this is concerned, and that's you want to set this to linear dodge. Okay, when you set it to linear dodge, this is going to get rid of the black, and your reflections are going to show through when there's another color underneath. So let me show you what I mean. If I put a new layer in here and press Shift F5 to fill, and let's just select a color of some sort, we see our reflection there. So we can change that color all day long, and it doesn't matter, and we don't have to re-render anything. Okay. So let's see what else we have. Is our shadow ready? Yep, there's our shadow. So let's go ahead and bring that in. And I want to press Control A, Control C. Oops. First things first, same thing with the alpha channels. So layer, layer mask from transparency. Now you see we got our alpha channel, and let's just delete this. Okay. Let's press Control A, Control C, and Control Shift V. And we'll call this ground shadow. Shadow. And for this one, we want to set it to multiply. Let's go multiply. There you go. Also, you should see here there's these little white fringes and whatnot. Remember what I showed you earlier with the layer, matting, defringe? That's going to help with those edges. So make sure that your layers are defringed. And that should clean up all of that. Okay, so there we go. Now let's bring back that color now that we have the ground shadow in, and you can see it doesn't matter. We can make this any color we want, and we don't have to go back and re-render anything. Okay. If you want to make it darker, you can simply duplicate the layer. So if I click and drag and select it over the new layer button, I can keep duplicating this shadow, and I can get it darker. Okay. The other thing I want to do with this is I want to make sure that that shadow stays nice and tight around here and doesn't bleed out to the edges. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click and select my brush tool, and I'm going to set my color to pure white, and we're going to increase this brush size and just make sure that near the edges of the frame all this is just pure white. Really just tighten that shadow in there so that you don't end up seeing shadows that get cut off at some point in time. And like I said, with this blend mode set to multiply, white is not going to show up. The only thing that's going to show up is the dark color, and that's what allows you to put this over any color, regardless of what it is. Okay, so moving on, we need to set up our glow effect here. So let's get rolling with that. And we can take the render we already have and do that. So, but we do want to do this in 32-bit mode. So let's open up our initial render, which we do have already. And the thing I want to do is I want to get this mask over into this 32-bit document. So if I press the magic wand tool and select those areas, and then press Control-C and Control-Shift-V, it's going to prompt you that it's different color space because we are going from 8 to 32 bits, but just go ahead and accept that and it will be fine. And now that those masks are in there, I'm going to use that trick, that Control left click on the layer, which isolates just those pieces. Okay? So let's hide our masks, and then let's press Control-J to duplicate to a new layer. So now what I've done is just isolated just the glowing pieces, just our emissive materials, so they're by themselves. Okay? Now what I want to do is duplicate them one more time, and we're going to set this blend mode to linear dodge, okay, which is going to give us this nice glow effect. And if we go into Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, we can start to blur this out. Now that does look kind of crazy, and the reason is because the intensity of those pixels. So we can tune this and we'll get it looking right. So let's go into our exposure with that layer selected and start to knock this back. Okay. Might even want to do less blur on that. So let's undo. And let's try something around 8. Yeah, we'll try around 9.8 pixels. Okay, so let's go into our exposure. So image, adjustments, exposure, and let's start to knock this back. And that should soften that glow look. Okay. Now, what I want to do is take those, and we need to get this into our 8-bit document. So I'm just going to go to Image, Adjustments, and do HDR toning. It says HDR toning will flatten the document. Do you want to proceed? Yes, that's fine. And let's go back to our simple mode, exposure and gamma. And what this is doing is this is converting this to 8-bit, where we're going to send it. Because if you don't do it this way, when you just drag those layers to your 8-bit document, the color might be a bit off. So now that we have that, let's press Control-A, Control-C, and Control-Shift-V. Okay? So what we want to do is use our blend modes here. So we'll set this to linear dodge. And there we've got our glow. And you can always go in and blur this even more. Let's put it against a dark background so we can kind of see what's going on. And we do have some glow there. Okay. And let's go ahead and name this. So we'll call this light glow. You can always knock back the opacity too if it's feeling a bit intense. And like I said, you can try and blur it out more. So I just duplicated the layer. Let's get a little bit more blur in here. Soften that a bit. And there you go. Okay, so now that we've set all this up, let's take a look at being able to put this on top of something else. So let's just create a simple abstract background. So we'll do 10 inches by 8 inches high. And we're just going to create some sort of stage to present our product on. So let's go to the gradient tool, and all I have here is just a gray to a lighter gray. And let's go to our layers palette, and we'll just create that. We'll create another one that's very similar, but I'm going to press Control-T to squish this down, give us sort of a stage to put this thing on. And we can also create a new layer and fill it with this darker gray. So also we are in 32-bit mode. We actually want to be in 8. And then let's take this stage thing and let's blur it out. Kind of soften that edge a bit. And we'll also do the same to this one. And let's create something for a vignette. So we'll just fill one more layer on top with a black, create a layer mask, subtract that out, and we can drop the opacity a little bit. Okay, so let's take our composite here with everything that we have set up, and let's take it into our background. So really this is the result and the benefit to doing all the setup that we did. It doesn't matter what background we want to put this on, we don't have to re-render. Okay. Let me increase the size of this. Try that again. Okay. Doesn't matter what color background we have, it's all there. Okay. So if we decided we want the ground shadow, we can have it. If we want the ground reflection, we can get rid of that. And if we wanted to change the color of our background, we could certainly do that. And we've made sure that we've set it up in such a way that we can do all this with minimal work involved. So, all right. So I think that about wraps it up for today. Hopefully that wasn't too much information. But if you want to go back and view any of this, we do post all of our webinars on our YouTube channel. So that will be available for you. We'll go ahead and get that up today if you want to go back and take care of that. But before we end, just if anybody has any questions, feel free to fire away. Could be about this webinar, could be about KeyShot in general, could be about network rendering. You name it. If you got a question, feel free to ask, and we'll be happy to answer it.
Do you have, on the rubber grip, a pass where you can change, where you can do a colorize? Show how you can change the color to a hue shift? Yes.
Okay. So one of the questions is, can you change colors of your items, of your objects, since you've separated them? And yes, absolutely. And that's one of the benefits, again, to doing this sort of method, is if we decided we wanted to change the color of one of these things, for example, the rubber grip, I could go to Hue Saturation, select Colorize, and change that. You know, it's all a matter of setting things up so you can do that. One thing I would probably want to do if I was doing that is create a new layer and go to Hue Saturation, press Colorize. Let's change the color to something like green. But you can see in here, we probably don't want the green. So what I would do is I would create a layer mask. And if I start to paint black, you can get rid of that. So there you go. Okay, any other questions?
Pretty much everything's answered.
Okay. All right. Well, if everything's answered, I just want to thank you all once again for attending today. I hope this was useful. Hope you gained some useful insight on setting up images for marketing purposes. And like I said, we'll post this webinar again later. If you missed the HDRI resource from earlier, here's that URL again. Like I said, 3 free HDR packs available online. So if I were you, I would take advantage of that. Just expands your library a bit more. And yeah, so in the future, if any of you have any requests for webinars, please send us an email at info@luxion.com. We'd be happy to cover any topic that you're interested in. I'll also go ahead and post the source files for this as well, so you can take a look, and I'll include the Photoshop document and the passes. So, all right, thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you next time.